So
I can't tell you how excited I am for this, you guys.
Likewise.
A big fan, I mean, both of Janet's knowledge and of Rick's cheese. And I mean, you've got the cheeses of Nazareth here. I'm really excited.
I'm not sure about that.
I've been a fan for a long time, from day one.
From day one, we've known Janet. Let me just close this shade. I'm still kind of washing out.
Yeah, can you go?
Okay, we were on.
All right.
Let's get the show on the road. Who's in charge here?
You are. You're the man.
I'm the man. Oh my God, that's crazy. That was a stupid.
Enjoy it while it lasts.
Can I get you both to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your past?
Sure. Ladies first.
Yeah, go, Janet.
Okay. I'm Janet Fletcher, and I'm here in my Napa kitchen. I'm the publisher of a blog called Planet Cheese, which is once a week quick read in your inbox. If you don't already get it, I hope you'll sign up on my website, which is janetfletcher.com. I'm a food writer, a longtime food writer about food, wine, beverages, beer. But cheese is a specialty and a great passion, and I'm really excited to be here with one of my favorite cheesemakers and local luminary, Rick Lafranchi from Nicasio Valley Cheese. I had suggested that we use his cheeses for the tasting today because I'm a big fan of all of them, and Rick will tell us a little bit more about his family story, I hope. Sure.
Okay, well, I'm Rick Lafranchi, obviously, and my family's been in Marin County now going back almost to the early 1850s, actually, with a great-great-grandfather. And at that time, Marin County had a population of about 3,000 people, and there was a lot of opportunity here, and he took advantage of that opportunity and did quite well for himself. And my grandmother was actually was a Dulcini, which is an old Marin County family. He was her grandfather. And then where our story really begins, though, is in 1910 when our grandfather, Fred Lafranchi, migrated to California from the village of Maggia, Switzerland. And he came over with a couple buddies at the sponsorship of his uncle, who is a Rotoli, who actually owned what's now the McAvoy Olive Oil Ranch there on Red Hill in Petaluma. And so he worked for him for a while and then went out and struck out doing different things. And in 1919 settled on our ranch in Nicasio, where our family is still today. And so for 100 years now, plus we've been operating a dairy on the ranch, and a lot of good years, but then there's been some difficult years. And back in the early 2000s, our dairy was faced with a dilemma. We were a conventional milk producer at the time, and the challenges of the conventional milk market were quite extreme. You'd have great years of pricing, or not even great years, great 6 months, and then the prices would crash and stay crash for 2 years at a time, and whatever you'd gain, you'd get back. And so we knew if we were going to sustain the ranch for the next generation, we had to do something different. And prior to my dad's passing in 2002, they'd actually done some research into the idea of cheese making. The cowgirls were getting started in 97, Point Reyes in 2000. And we kind of thought back to when we were after he passed, we were thinking back to our first trip as a family to Maggia, Switzerland in 1973. First time my father had been there since he was a little boy. And during that trip, we enjoyed many fine local cheeses that were unique to anything we'd experienced. And I can remember Dad observing, wouldn't it be great at some point to make these cheeses on our Nicasio ranch? Well, we were all pretty young at the time and didn't pay it the heed at that point that we did later. And so anyway, with that, we thought, well, wait a minute, let's see what can happen with this. And in 2004, we were back again in Switzerland for the first time since '73, experienced some cheeses that were unique to our cheese experience. And we thought, as a family, came back, talked about it, and said, hey, is there something we can do with this to add value to our dairy product by kind of going back for our future, so to speak? And so in 2007, we were able to go back and spend some time over the course of the summer making cheese with Maurizio Lorenzetti. At the end of that trip, we knew two things. We wanted to make the cheeses he was making, and we wanted him to help us get started. And we asked him with the idea that he probably would say no. And it took him about a half a second to say, in fact, yes, he would like to come. And so we thought it was going to be 2008. It was actually January 31st, 2010, when Maurizio arrived. We started making cheese a couple weeks later. And so all the cheeses are modeled after cheeses of the Valley Maggia in Switzerland. That's cheeses they make in that part of the world. And we're here, and we've been a part of a wonderful cheese community of some great cheese writers, food writers, and Janet. And we're very fortunate to have that. And anyway, that kind of brings us up to date. We've been making cheese now for 10 years.
It's kind of
go ahead, Aaron. I'm sorry.
well, I was fascinated by Rick's story, and I just looked kind of into the name Lafranchi, and I was amazed to find that the only Lafranchis are all from Ticino. They're all from the Italian part of Switzerland, and nowhere else does that name come. And they believe the name derives from the word for family in that part of Switzerland. And I thought that was pretty appropriate too for your lifestyle. But I mean, what could be more deeply rooted in cheese than coming from Switzerland and being a family cheese maker? And I'm curious to, as a surfer, I often go past your place in Nicasio, and I'm always amazed by how unaffected it is by the seasons, that it seems kind of lush and green there all year round. And I was wondering how your family decided to settle there, and what was the decision in their minds to settle in that place?
I think at that particular time that the opportunity was there. Actually, kind of a little bit of backstory with my grandfather, taking over the ranch in 1919. His future sister-in-law and her husband had been living on that ranch from exactly when, I'm not sure, because it's actually right adjacent to the Dulcini Ranch where my grandmother grew up. And so I think it was kind of a family, guided opportunity that was made available to him and his future bride, and they married in 1920. And I wish it did stay green and lush all year long, I should say. Unfortunately, not the case. It's pretty brown right now. It's green. Some years you might be right. You might have seen green grass in July, I think it was last year, because we had an exceptionally long rainy season. This year, not the case. So it's a little browner, but still a wonderful area. Marin County, you may be aware, was the original dairy capital of California. And that wasn't an accident. It was an area, especially the West Marin area, in particular Point Reyes. It has a longer grazing season because if you always hear the Bay Area weather reports, they're always saying rain starting in the North Bay. And so consequently, we have a longer grazing season here than you do in most other parts of Marin County and definitely in other parts of the Bay Area. So it was a logical choice to start those dairies in the 1850s in Marin County.
It's really interesting that there's a whole history of Swiss Italian and Italian Swiss in that part of Marin and Sonoma. A number of the cheesemakers are Swiss Italian or Italian Swiss. And I don't know about you, Aaron, but my first wine memories are of drinking Italian Swiss colony wine out of a jug, and I never knew what an Italian Swiss colony. What did that mean? What was an Italian Swiss colony? There were a whole wave of Italian Swiss who came over and settled in that area, and started like a commune, and were making wine, and then they bring their cousins over and their uncles, and there came to be a big community of Italian Swiss and Swiss Italians in the dairy and the wine industry.
Yeah, between 1850 and 1920, some 30,000 young men from the Ticino region emigrated to the States. And there was a couple reasons for that. Was one that a lot of them prior to that worked in Italy. And then there was some disruption with the Italian government and they closed the border. so they had no work. And then the attractiveness of the California Gold Rush. That's my great-great-grandfather. That's what brought him over, you know. And so, and it was just a kind of looked upon as a land of opportunity. And you'll see there's actually, you know, pockets of Swiss Italians all up and down the coast. I have like my grandfather's sister, she settled in the Seattle area. And then there's other Swiss Italians that were more up in Ferndale. There's also down around Santa Maria and places like that as well. So there was quite a, you know, large number that came over. And one other thing that gave them an edge when they got started is in Switzerland, they instituted mandatory public education in 1830. So pretty much everybody who could come could read and write. And that really helped them as well.
So Rick, tell me a little bit about, you made a conversion to organic farming in 2006 and the property became completely organic in 2012. Tell me about that transition.
Well, it actually, the thoughts towards that started back before my father passed away. And at that time we were considering transitioning, but transitioning in those days meant that you had to feed your cows for 1 year, 100% organic diet. But the milk that you sold, you'd receive a conventional price. Well, the cost of doing organic dairying are quite high as compared to conventional, and there was just no way that could pencil out. So we had to pass on that opportunity at the time. And then in 2006, Clover came to us and said, we're adding to our organic lineup of dairies. And now you can transition by being transitioning your first calf heifers. Just the new cow animals entering the herd would be organic. The rest of the herd could stay conventional. And over time, well, for us, over a 6-year period, as you know, all the new cows entered the herd as organic. As the old cows left the herd, we didn't add to the conventional side. We just let that kind of deplete. And so by 2012, we were I think there was 25 or 30 cows left at that time in the conventional side. So we became 100% organic.
And you were, I think, I don't know if you still are, but you were for a time the only farmstead organic cheesemaker in the state, I believe. Farmstead meaning that they make the cheese with their own milk.
Yes. As far as I know, that's still the case. Yeah. No, we're, you know, I don't know. I think the other organic guys probably, you know, have looked at it and maybe it didn't work for them. I'm surprised no one else has done it, but you know, that's what we are and what we've done. And we had a big enough family and the right situation to make that opportunity work. And if you don't have a large family like us, the Giacomini's, people like that, it's pretty difficult to do both ends. Yeah. So.
Shall we drink some wine?
Sure.
I think maybe we need to try some cheese first.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you tell us about the cheeses, Rick, and then we can
Sure.
start there?
You want to start with the Formagella?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Just so you know, this is our Formagella. The name Formagella comes from Switzerland. It's modeled after the cheese in Switzerland, coincidentally called Formagella. And it was the first cheese we experienced over there. It was a nice brie-style cheese, mild. And the interesting thing about this cheese was when we first started making it, Maurizio told us, well, it's ready at 15 days, best at 30, and done at 45. And what we found, it didn't take too long, that over the years, it's actually, you can eat it at 15 days. You're not going to get any flavor to it. It's really starting to kick in at 30, and at 45, it's actually hitting its stride and then rolls all the way out to about 90 days. So it's got a good long shelf life. And Maurizio felt the difference why our cheeses lasted longer here than his did over there was in Switzerland. He was buying his milk from a cooperative. It was being trucked about 4 hours across country, a blend of about 200 dairies and milk cans. And he felt that our cheese, because we are farmstead, because the creamery's right here, because we only use the freshest morning milk to make our cheese, that our cheeses just have a longer life and more flavor than, in fact, what he was able to produce in Switzerland.
Now, is that something that's rare, that you have your own cattle and you're making your own cheese on the same place, or is that's less common than? you would think.
Well, as far as organic goes, we're the only one in California that I'm aware of. I think, you know, even on the other side, conventional or organic, there's not very many. I mean, there's a few, you know, there's probably, I don't know, Janet, you might know better than I do. Would you say in California, there may be 5 or 6?
Yeah, it's a little more common in other states that dairies are farmstead, especially in Vermont, somewhat in Wisconsin. But, you know, it's not easy to have, as Rick said, the resources to both care for the animals and make the cheese. And although it's kind of the ideal because it's like having an estate winery where you're in control of the grapes, you're in control of everything from start to finish. And it sounds ideal, but that means you have to have the know-how and the you know, labor power to do that. And sometimes it's better if those two are separated. But that being said, fresh milk is, you know, key to making great cheese. So Rick has a leg up, you know, having the cows right there. Yeah.
You see a lot of differences in the color of butter by where the cows graze. There's that Spanish guy that makes foie gras in Spain that has his geese eating from his flowers and clover and stuff on his property, and his foie gras has a very unusual color. And I'm wondering if you can sort of tell your milk from other milk in other places just from what your cows are eating.
I'm not quite that sharp, but I will say that for example, our cheese foggy morning in the spring when the cows are on grass, especially when they're early on the grass and it's really abundant and very supple and delicious, that the milk, the cheese will actually have like veins of like gold like through it, and that's something to do with the fat and I can't think of the exact word, where the milk is higher in a particular content that makes a difference in that. So you can at times, you know, but actually comparing it side by side, all the dairies pretty much in the North Bay are organic. Everybody grazes because they have to, you know, there's no other option. And so probably milks don't differ a whole lot, although I can still remember Maurizio telling us that, you know, in the Val Maggia in Switzerland is very reminiscent to me of the almost somewhat like the Yosemite Valley, where you have very, very steep hillsides and little patches of grass up and above where they take their cows in the summertime. And he would say that on one side of the valley, the milk would taste slightly different than the other side of the valley, just because you had a little different mineral content there versus what you'd have on the other side. So I think there's all kinds of nuances. I mean, the one thing about cheese is, especially specialty cheese, is that there's so many variables involved. To exactly duplicate what you did, you know, a month in a row would be very difficult, because the cows are always, you know, their diets change somewhat throughout the course of the year. In the spring, more grass, then maybe at one point it's 50 or 60% grass, then maybe it goes down to 30%, it might even go down to 15. Well, that all has an impact on the milk. And so, you know, that's where you get the differences and the little nuances and stuff.
Now, there's that,
what I'm noticing when I look at this cheese that I really admire is that the paste, which is what we call the interior, doesn't separate from the rind. A lot of times, I'm sure people have seen this, when you pick up a piece of brie or camembert, that inside comes away from the rind. And that's not a good thing. You don't want that. And Rick's brother, Scott, who's the cheesemaker, has done a great job of keeping it, you know, together, keeping the rind and the paste together. And you can also, this is just a perfectly right piece of cheese. You can see how it's it's very oozy and gooey right under the rind. That's what cheese people call the cream line. It's very creamy. And then it's firmer at the center. So you get kind of two texture experiences at once. This is looks absolutely perfect, and I can't wait to eat it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, they've worked very hard for 10 years now of a lot of just little tweaks. And like, for example, when we first started making Formagella, I was one of, I felt, about 80% of people who couldn't taste it. And then they tweaked the recipe just a little bit, primarily letting the curd rest a little longer, cutting it a little larger. And now it's one of my favorite cheeses.
Yeah, it's very mushroomy, very buttery, just melts away. The texture's lovely, and you get that kind of yeasty, mushroomy flavor. It's delicate. It's not a robust cheese, and I don't think it's meant to
No,
be.
not at all. It'll always be a relatively mild cheese, but the important thing is that it does have a nice little flavor to it as well. So.
And a lactic, little acid, finish, a lactic finish.
Okay.
And I just did great with the white.
It's a beautiful finish. There's a question from someone here that says, actually it's from Mari, one of my good friends. She's wondering if the milk is raw or pasteurized.
The milk is pasteurized. We do pasteurize all our cheeses. They're all pasteurized.
Yeah, in fact, they have to be for this, at least for this cheese. By law, it would have to be pasteurized because it's less than 60 days old.
We did do the reserve, which we'll taste later. We did a raw milk version of that for a while. We did it for about 6 months. And what we found there was the FDA started really heavily scrutinizing those operations that were not pasteurizing their milk. And we just were so new in the business at that time. We said, you know what, we don't want to get into a territory where they could find something that would cause us, problems. And so we opted to just stay with pasteurization.
Janet, do you have any ideas behind the quality of pasteurized versus raw milk cheeses, or?
Well, you really, you can't make a blanket statement. There are just some fabulous cheeses made with pasteurized milk, just as there are some great traditional cheeses that are made with raw milk and always will be, like Parmigiano Reggiano and Conte. It's part of their definition legally. They have to be made with raw milk. But if you talk to cheesemakers, I think, the purists are going to tell you that they like having all the potential that raw milk carries. It has all the bacteria, that are present in the milk when it comes out of the cow, and so there's potential for flavor development. With a pasteurized milk cheese, the cheesemaker has to add it back by adding cultures, selecting the cultures very carefully. So in some ways, it's like making a wine with indigenous yeast to work with raw milk. It can go really crazy, and it can also, soar to great heights, but it's a little less predictable compared to making a wine with yeast that you've selected, or making a cheese with pasteurized milk where you've introduced the cultures that you want. So you have a little more control.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of wine, my Dissonance is getting a little warm. Should we taste some?
Yes, why don't we do that? That is a good idea. So I'm going to open up my Dissonance, and we're tasting the 2019 Dissonance, and this is a blend of 87% Sauvignon Blanc and 13% Semillon. The Sauvignon Blanc portion of this wine comes from a vineyard that we planted specifically for Blackbird, initially to make Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon on Lee Hudson's ranch in Carneros. And it was specifically planted for us, and we had this section that was lower down on the property that was this wonderful tuft soil, volcanic ash soil, totally unusual to Carneros. And we decided to plant Sauvignon Blanc there to see what would happen. And a little bit putting the cart ahead of the horse, because we didn't really have a Sauvignon Blanc. We didn't have any Sauvignon Blanc at the time. So that kind of forced us from becoming Blackbird, focused on Merlot, Cabernet Franc, red varieties from Bordeaux, to this white wine. So they came up with the name Dissonance because it's so opposed to what we did before. And we added a little bit of Semillon, and the Semillon comes from Knights Valley. And it's a pretty good example of the Northern California climate, because you have the two appellations that are the most affected by the maritime influence near us. Knights Valley, which gets the fog coming in from the Russian River Valley into Knights Valley, and then the fog coming off of the San Francisco Bay in Carnero. So both very cool areas. The Semillon in the Knights Valley area on 40-year-old vines, and kind of classic Semillon.
Yeah, I get a lot of grapefruit and citrus notes in the wine, and just nice brightness, zesty.
I think that the grapefruit definitely coming from the Sauvignon Blanc. That's one of the classic aromatic qualities of Sauvignon Blanc. And that citrus, especially the lemon, the kind of lanolin character as well, that waxiness. Sometimes it's almost like pecorino, actually, coming off of the Semillon. You really get that lemon aromatic from that Semillon character.
Yeah, this is the kind of wine, I think it ought to go with the Formagella, the first wine. It might even go even better with the cheese that Rick mentioned earlier, the Foggy Morning, which is a younger cheese and, you know, more tart and fresh tasting, and really be, I think, a great match for this bright, fresh white. I actually think the reds are going to go pretty nicely with all three of Rick's cheeses.
Okay.
Janet, I think it's not easy to match wine and cheeses, because you're dealing with a lot of different flavors, and you're dealing with a lot of different levels of sweetness as well. And so, what are your recommendations for people that are trying to match cheese and wines?
Well, I'm really trying to protect the wine, because the cheese isn't going to change. The wine almost never changes the cheese, but the cheese can really change the wine. So I'm trying to do no harm to the wine. And I would say my number one principle is to try to match up intensities. So if you have an intense or light, young, fresh cheese, you're going to pair that with a light, young, fresh, probably white wine or a young, fresh red. And then as you move up that scale of intensities in the wine or the cheese, you know, you can match up bigger with bigger. So, you know, at the extreme, I think Rick's Nicasio Reserve is going to be a fairly intense wine, red cheese, and it's going to need a bigger red. So I think we've got these kind of Bordeaux style reds. It's going to be a great match with this more intense cheese that gets its intensity in large part from being aged and concentrated. So if you think about nothing else, think about trying to match up intensities, and you're probably not going to go too far wrong.
What about young red wines?
Yeah, you know, they can work, Gamay style wines, you know, really fresh Grenache, anything that you might have, rosé, anything that you might have at the start of a meal or of an evening is something I would want with a lighter, fresher cheese. You know, mozzarella, very fresh goat cheese. You know, a piece of ricotta with tomatoes. That's when I want something very light and fresh. And it's partly, Aaron, that I'm also trying to kind of, in addition to lining up intensities, I like to kind of match the moment between the wine and the cheese. So I don't think people think about this enough, but if you're having, if it's a hot day and you're sitting outside at 6 o'clock and you're having a plate of antipasti and a little fresh piece of Foggy Morning, you don't want a big wine. You want something that's light and fresh and easily, quaffable, easy to drink. And then later in the evening, you're sitting around, you want the conversation to kind of keep going. You want a more serious wine and a more serious piece of cheese.
Interesting.
So that's my take on it. I think we should try these other two reds and then go back to the last two cheeses and see what we think. I
am in. So we have two older reds. The first is the Illustration, and that's a 2010. And it's from multiple different vineyards around Napa. I chose some older wines because I thought, in my mind, they would be a little bit more cheese friendly. And Illustration is 48% Merlot. It's 30% Cabernet Franc and 22% Cabernet Sauvignon. This is from 2010. It's a vintage that was pretty unusual for us. A vintage that started out with quite a lot of rainfall after several years, 3 classic years of drought. And so that rainfall kind of pushed the bud break back a little bit. And it was a very, very cold season for the first, until September. It was below average temperatures until about September. And a lot of winemakers in the valley made very poor decisions, thinking that it was going to be so late that they needed to get more sun on their grapes. And so they really opened up their canopies, took off a lot of leaves, exposed the fruit. And then suddenly in September and October, we had above average temperatures. It was very warm, and a lot of people got burned by that. And I was pretty proud of myself that I stayed my hands to pull leaves on the vines and left the canopies as they were, and the grapes ripened very well. And we didn't get a lot of sort of pruny characters or a lot of overripe fruit. And the wines were really, it was a real successful vintage for us in 2010. So,
It's got some very nicely developed aromas, you know, from age, and it still has very firm grip. There's, it hasn't softened all that much in the palate.
no, it's very, very aromatic, classic kind of Merlot aromas in there. You really get the floral component of the Merlot with that iris and a little bit of violet there, but also the plummy cherry aromas. And then the Cabernet Franc is really making a strong play in there too. You see the cedar character, and there's a little bit of blue fruit in there as well.
Delicious, great cheese board wine. Yeah.
Okay, shall we look at the next wine? It's Paramour, and this is it's a Cabernet Franc dominant wine. This is 61% Cabernet Franc, 25% Merlot, and 14% Cabernet Sauvignon. And again, from vineyards pretty much throughout the valley, Cabernet from Diamond Mountain, from high altitude in above Oakville, from Hudson Vineyard in Carneros that we talked about, from Crocker Star Vineyard in St. Helena off of that old benchland soil. This is a little bit more evolved than the 10. The 9, again, was a drought vintage where most of the rain from the year fell in February. I think we had 14 inches of rain here in Napa Valley just in the month of February alone. And then a year that stayed relatively cool throughout the year, and had little problem with frost, so it was a very early bud break in that vintage.
These wines still have a lot of, they still have a lot of life.
Yeah, very, very much so.
Yeah. I think I love having all this concentration and power in the wines, because I know we have 2 cheeses coming up that have a lot of personality and need some strength in the wine. Rick, what do you think we should taste next? Should we taste Tomino or should we taste Nicasio Reserve?
I'm thinking the Tomino.
Okay, tell us about it.
Yeah, Tomino. Okay, first of all, I want to point out, and the people who ordered the Blackbird Trio from us online, you got this. You got actually what turned out to be a very still immature piece of Tomino. It's about a month old, so it's really should be maturing a bit more. It's, for whatever reason, this one's moving along a little bit slower. So be patient with it. It's only going to get better, because this is what we actually end up, what we're going to taste today is this one that's about 3 weeks older, and it's already, you can see that it's starting to develop its washed rind look to it. And Tomino's a washed rind cheese, lightly washed, though. It's only washed twice during its 3 to 4 week aging process. So when it starts, like I said, it's a bloomy rind. It's similar to a brie. And then as it ages, it turns oranger and oranger. And when it gets to full maturity at about 65 days, it's orange and it's funky. And so it's kind of an interesting cheese in that regard. The term Tamino is reflective again of a cheese in the Valley Maggia in Switzerland. And we liked that name and thought we'd give it that, assignment. But it's an interesting cheese too, as you'll see. It's kind of, this has been sitting out for a few hours, but the middle gets soft and kind of oozes. And it's just in the right circumstance, it's a really nice cheese.
I don't know if people can see is yours doing this, Aaron? Mine's really starting to, it's almost like fondue. It's very, very supple. It's been at room temperature for quite a while, and it's just super ripe.
So I want to get to the room temperature question in a second, but I just want to say how serious Rick is, because we all had the cheese that everyone ordered that was, in his opinion, slightly immature. It looked fabulous to me, but Rick had this cheese sent to us all today, had it driven up from Marin County for all of us, and it arrived at my house a little before this tasting. And I think that is the sign of my kind of cheese guy that's going to take the time to find exactly the ripeness of cheese for us to taste today. I think that's really impressive. Janet, I wanted to get back to you on that idea of cheese, the temperature of service, how to store it. I know that's a big deal for people in France. I remember when I first moved to France, if I put my cheese in the refrigerator, everybody would say, "Oh my God, you're disgusting, you disgusting American. Go back to McDonald's, you're embarrassing us." And I just wanted to get some of your opinions on how to age cheese, how to treat cheese.
But don't you hate it when people serve your wine too warm?
Yes.
Either your white or your red, it just ruins it. And the thing about cheese is it's kind of like butter. It doesn't really blossom until it's at room temperature. So you want to, especially with these two bloomy rind cheeses, it's very important that they should be at room temperature, because that's when you're going to get the full lushness of the texture. Otherwise, they're going to be hard like butter. And a cheese like this, like Rick's Nicasio Reserve, it doesn't suffer at all from being out, for quite a while. So you want to bring them to room temperature. You don't want, a cheese like this is going to maybe start to sweat a little bit if your kitchen's hot and it's at room temperature for 2 or 3 hours. Some of the fat's going to come out of it, and you don't want that because it won't go back in. But room temperature, cool room temperature is good for cheese. So depending on the size of the cheese, you might take it out 30 minutes ahead, up to an hour or two ahead if you've got a big chunk. You don't need to overdo it, but you definitely want cheese at room temperature. And more, just as important, say you bought a pound of cheese and you're 2 people that night for dinner. You're not going to eat a pound of cheese. Just cut off what you think you're going to eat and bring that to room temperature. Don't bring the whole thing to room temperature, and then, because it doesn't really like to go back and forth. Bring to room temperature what you think you're going to eat and keep the rest in the fridge.
Are you saying that I should be embarrassed about eating a pound of cheese?
More power to you.
I'm outraged.
Yeah.
There's a great cheese, my favorite cheese quote by Briard de Savarin is, cheese is where milk makes its leap into immortality. And I want to get Rick and Janet to talk about that transformation process. First, what is cheese, and how is it made, and how does that transformation process differ from place to place, from cheesemaker to cheesemaker?
Well, maybe I'll just start it off, because my understanding is much less deep than Rick's, since he's the brother of a cheesemaker. But cheese is all about preserving milk. It's taking something that's very perishable, that would die in a day or two in a hot climate, and making it last. And to do that, you have to get the water out and the whey out of the milk. So the longer you want the cheese to last, the more whey you have to get out of it. And there are a lot of steps you can take to do that, whether you're pressing the cheese, cutting the curd really small, heating the curd. All these are methods for getting whey out of the cheese and making a cheese that lasts long. But you don't do any of those steps for this. You don't press it. You don't cook the curd because you want to keep the moisture in.
Right.
So, Rick, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I think, every cheese is different. Every cheese has 1,000 different ways of making it. The things that we do are, in fairly general terms, is put the milk into the vat, warm it up, add the culture to it, pasteurize it first, then add the culture. And then from there, it's all on really a lot to do with the feel of the cheesemaker, that they can feel as you cut the curd. Once you develop the curd, let it rest for a while. How long you let it rest is how much longer it might continue to develop. And then from there, cutting it, how fine you cut it or how big you cut it will all be factors in the ultimate result of your cheese. And then once you do cut it, do you drain the vat with the curd and the whey together, or do you drain whey off first and let the curd sit and rest for a bit? Those will all be factors. Once you get it out and into the molds, how many times you flip it, what temperature the room is. There's just a million different variables involved in the process. And so that's why it's very difficult, at least, in an artisan world, specialty world, for two cheesemakers to duplicate the flavor of a particular cheese. They might be similar, but they're never going to be the same. So,
Just say I'm really enjoying the Tomino with the Paramour. It's very classic in France to have a Camembert with a Bordeaux or a Brie with a Bordeaux, and this is I think a similar match here on the West Coast, where we have this sort of Brie-like cheese, but with a little more stink to it, a little more beefiness, and it needs a wine that has a lot of tannic structure like the Paramour. I think it's a great match.
Yeah, that's a very nice wine.
Let's tell us a little bit about the Nicasio Reserve, Rick, which is really the very different cheese of the three that we have. We had two bloomy rinds, soft ripened cheeses, and this is an aged cheese. Quite a different style, much more mature. What do we have here?
Well, this is the classic Swiss Italian mountain cheese is what it is. It's the cheese. If you go into the mountains of Switzerland in the summertime, you'll see the hillsides are dotted with Alps, which is alpine pastures. And there's little huts where they, a number of different, I think in the Valley Maggia alone, there was like 32 different cheesemakers who'd have an Alp where they'd have, either cows or buy milk from an adjacent dairyman who had cows up there. And so they'll make the cheese up there in the summer and then transport it down to, historically to keep them fed through the cold winter months when things weren't as readily available. What we do with this cheese is this is an aged cheese. So we try to age it for 6 months to ensure that it has the maximum development. I'm not sure how old this piece is here today. I had the wrapper here a minute ago, but anyway, it should be around 6 months old, and that's our target date. Sometimes we bring it out a little bit younger, but ultimately, hopefully, by the time people actually start enjoying it, it's 6 months old. It's obviously a drier cheese, but a flavorful cheese, and it's got, again, I think the cheeses of that region reflect the diet of that region, and their cooking, if you notice, is between polenta, risotto, gnocchi, those things like that are all pleasant dishes. There's nothing that's real powerful. There's no Limburger or anything of real strong flavors, but very nice, flavors that are enjoyable. And I think it's a reflection of that.
For folks who are watching and have the cheese, I would suggest that a great thing to do with a cheese like this that's firm is to break it and then smell it right there. kind of like getting a fresh pour of wine in your glass where you get a burst of aroma. So that's what I like to do with these firm cheeses. And you get all those buttery notes, like warm butter and nuts. This cheese, you know, you look at it and you think it's going to be hard and granular in the mouth, and it's not. It's very creamy. It's not as firm as you think it's going to be. It's got a beautiful creaminess and just a buttery quality that makes. To me, this is a great snacking cheese. You just want to keep eating it because it's got that balance of sweetness and salt, and it's very balanced.
It has some wonderful fruity notes as well. I mean, it smells almost of pears. It's beautiful aromas, and I didn't notice that until Janet, you said to crack it open and smell it, and it's very aromatic. Beautiful.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting cheese in terms of its wine potential because it could go with a white wine, maybe not so much with the dissonance, but maybe a slightly richer white wine, but it's great with the reds. And it would go, I think, with even a fruitier, younger red. But I think it's really nice with these two as well, especially with the one that's more Merlot, the
Illustration,
which is more Merlot focused.
That's my love today. Is this and the Illustration are ideal together. So what's the history of cheese? I mean, where did it start and why did it start? And why do we have
really, it's all about, when people started herding sheep and cows, sheep and goats probably was where it started. And you just can't keep the milk. So you have to figure out how to preserve it. And they probably recognized that if they just let it sit, it soured, it made yogurt. And then if you added some of that yogurt to another batch of milk, you got more yogurt. And then if you drained that, you got cheese. So I'm sure just this gradual discovery, but what a wonderful discovery for humankind, because now you have this nutritious food that you can keep. And it allowed people to, to settle and not have to keep moving all the time because they could store this cheese and survive on it. So it's been, they've figured out that by drawing off the moisture, and letting this fermentation happen, so you get the pH down, you get more acid built up, you put some salt on it, you make something that's keepable. And I have always been so fascinated by the parallels between winemaking and cheesemaking, because you're both cheesemakers and winemakers starting with, one main ingredient, grapes or milk. You have very few things that you add to it. You add a culture to it. And then you just make all sorts of decisions along the way that take it in different directions. You end up with so many different end results from basically the same starting point. So, and they're both great reflections of place, especially in Rick's case, because he is using his own milk from one place. It's just a great reflection of that West Marin terroir.
So there are a lot of cheeses that have their own appellations. I mean, we think about Brie de Meaux or the Bleu d'Auvergne and so on. Why is that? Are those places unique or?
Well, they would say they are for sure. And this is something that exists in Europe and not at all in the U.S. We don't have appellations. We have appellations for wine, but not for cheese. I think the cheese industry here is just too young, and cheesemakers are just too free-spirited. They don't want to be tied down and, to having to make cheese in a certain way. But in Europe, take Comté, for example, cheese made in the Jura Mountains in France. I've been in the Jura in June and seen those mountain pastures, and they are just breathtaking. They are just lush carpets of herbs and flowers and grasses. And when the Comté people tell you that that's why the cheese is so good, because that's what the cows are eating, it's easy to believe. The landscape is, it's unique to that place. So yes, they want to preserve it. So they have a appellation for Comté, and you have to make the cheese in a certain zone using certain breeds of cows. certain size, certain techniques. And it's a way of controlling quality primarily, to make sure that when consumers get a wheel of Conte, it's, maybe not always the same, but it's always good and reliable. That's really I think the thought behind the appellations in European cheeses, is try to protect the quality, and of course the marketplace.
Sure. Yeah.
We're seeing it now with feta, for example. The Greeks have protected the name feta, and so others can no longer use it. And that really is a commercial decision. You can make feta in France, you can make feta in Israel, but the Greeks own the name now, so that's a commercial protection.
So I have to admit, I became a cheese snob living in France. When you're sitting at the restaurant and the cheese cart rolls up and there's 3 million cheeses on it, and the famous De Gaulle quote, "You can't govern a country that has 300 different cheeses," and so on. And to Janet's credit, she changed my life and showed me a lot of these cheeses from the US. And there's a cheese renaissance going on that's been going on for 20 years now in this country. And you guys have been making cheese for over 100 years now in this country. And I think there's some great cheese being made here. Let's talk about the future of American cheese and what that looks like. I'm going with you first, Rick.
Yeah, okay. Well, my feeling is we've been at it 10 years now, and kind of involved in the artisan cheese world for about 15. And what I feel like with the American consumer, that we're getting somewhere closer to the end of the beginning, but there's still a long way to go. What really impresses me about the American interest in artisan cheese is actually among kids. What I've found over the years working many demos and farmers markets is little kids, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. Whatever it is, they love it. And no matter how strong it is, they still love it. Whereas their parents have great difficulty sometimes with the stronger cheeses. And I think just something, I think it's inherent in the human being that cheese in past generations was a huge, important factor of their diet. And then obviously our generation has gotten away from that. And all of a sudden really powerful cheeses are too much for us. Whereas somebody who hasn't had the chance to have that kind of spoil their view of it loves it. So I think the future, is bright. I think it's challenging. I mean, a lot of people have elected to get into cheese, which is wonderful. I think we have a great variety. I think it's growing all the time. But there's also, challenges. I mean, there's only an appetite for so much. And so it's an interesting, very interesting business that, we're obviously very happy we got into and have enjoyed tremendously. But I think the future is bright, but it's also one that you just don't want to plow into recklessly, let's put it that way.
Yeah, the French have a habit, and the Italians, they have cheese almost every day. The Greeks, feta is like almost on their plate almost every day. And Americans still don't have that habit of eating cheese every day. And
right.
Aaron, I had also the experience of living in France when I was in college and fell in love with cheese there and the cheese cart. And I think that really is what awakened me to the pleasures of cheese, because the way the French enjoy it, the end of a meal, it just slows down everything. You have another glass of wine, you have the cheese course that comes to your table, and it just keeps you at the table longer. And
Sure.
So to me, that's the pleasure of cheese. Above and beyond how delicious it is, the ritual of enjoying this fermented food with a great fermented beverage with your friends around the table. It's just the nicest time of the day when that cheese plate arrives and the great glass of wine is in front of you. So I hope more people will adopt that ritual. It doesn't have to be a fancy plate of cheese with all these garnishes and nuts and stuff. It can just be a single nice piece of cheese and whatever wine you feel like drinking.
Right. It's definitely something you share. It's not something you typically, you'll eat a little bit by yourself, but you won't like eat a pound. But share it with a friend is special.
Yeah.
I'm gonna end this by asking you each for a cheese memory, and I'm going to describe a cheese memory of mine, which was very dear to my heart. There was this wonderful hot bath in the very high mountains of the Andes in Chile, and you would have to go up there via this tiny little road. And along the tiny little road, there was a super small barn where a guy and his wife and little baby had goats, and they made a little goat cheese, and they just sold it to the people that were on their way up to this bath, this hot thermal bath. And you would buy a round of this cheese and go up and sit in this thermal bath and eat this cheese, and it was just fabulous. And we were at about 6,000 feet in altitude, and the cheese just tasted fantastic. And we had really bad wine, but it didn't matter because this cheese so created the experience and was fabulous. And this place was the dirtiest looking cheese manufacturer I have ever seen in my life, but the cheese was fabulous.
And you survived.
Give me a cheese memory to sign off with.
Go ahead, Rick.
Okay. Well, one of mine was back in 2013. My family, my two kids, they're now, one was not a spouse yet, but now is, and the other one was married, and her husband and their little boy, we all went back to Maja, to the village there for the first visit for all of us as a family. And the first day we were there, our cousin Gabriele and his wife Patrizia took us to a kind of a riverside spot called, I think, Via Postage, something like that. And it's a restaurant right on the river at one end of the valley. And we're there, and they have the big stone tables, and we're all around it and thinking, great. And the guy comes out with this plate of charcuterie and cheese, and it was just like mouth-watering. It looked so spectacular, and I thought, wow, I hope I won't be inappropriate if I ask for more, because we're going to run through this quickly. The next thing I knew, they brought out one for everybody, and everybody ate every bit that was on that plate, and it was fabulous. A wonderful selection of local cheeses, as well as their, this different salamis, copa, you name it, they had it, and it was great. It was decadent, but very enjoyable. And then the proprietor of the restaurant, his name was Christian, he took us into the cellar. And you talk about funny, ugly cheese. In his cellar, I don't quite know how things got this way, but he had blooming rind cheese, like 8-inch wheels, that was very good, that we experienced up top. And anyway, this cheese actually, by sitting in that cellar, the exterior was black. And, and I go, wow, I didn't realize cheese at that juncture could do that. But so no, that's my one of my great cheese experiences.
All right. Well, I was just flashing back to being a sophomore in college in France, in the south of France, and I was at an American campus with an American professor who spoke perfect French, and we were living in Provence. I was there for 6 months as a student, and we had the professor came to us students at the end of the semester, and he said, we had this party fund that part of your tuition went into this party fund, and we really haven't spent it all. So he was a great gourmand, and he said, I think we should go to a 3-star restaurant. So he took our party fund, and he made a reservation for us at a 3-star restaurant in Provence. First time I'd ever been in a fancy restaurant like that. And I will never forget when the waiter wheeled that cheese cart over to the table at the end of the meal, and I said, how many can I choose? And he said, Mademoiselle, you can have as many as you like. Wow, that was just, this heavenly moment to see all those magnificent cheeses and be able to just indulge to my heart's content.
All right.
It's fabulous, Janet. So I want to thank you both, Janet Fletcher, Queen of Cheese, we'll call you, and knowledgeable about everything cheese, and Rick Lafranchi, Nicasio Valley Cheese Company. Thanks very much for being with us. And
Thank you.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. The wines are really yummy.
Thank you. Keep
Thank
on cheesing. Keep on being cheesy.
Thanks everyone for joining.
All right. Bye-bye.